Welcome everybody to the Strange and Scary Mysteries of the Month, where we find you the creepiest true crime stories from all around the world currently going down, and lay them out here for you to check out. Thanks so much for tuning in to Scary Mysteries today. Here are the Strange and Scary Mysteries of the Month for February 2025. Number 5. The Hunt for a Killer. It was a regular morning over at Honolulu's McKinley High School, but very soon, everything on this day began to take a very abnormal turn. It started with a few whispers that turned into a buzz, and soon the conversations of everybody turned almost frantic when the truth came out. A student had been found dead inside the building. Her name was Dawn Mamora, and she was just 16 years old. Her body had been discovered on the second floor of the school, having been assaulted and then strangled, and left right there in the classroom to be found by whoever walked in first. The news spread fast, but details remained scarce. Everyone started chatting and speculating, coming up with their own theories, suspects, and questions. Was it a stranger, a student, even a teacher who did it? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, was the killer still walking among them? The last time anyone saw Dawn alive was on the night of March 20th, 1977, and she had gotten a phone call from an unknown male and told her mother she was going to meet friends at a nearby shopping center, and totally normal for a teenager to do. At some point that night, Dawn ended up at McKinley High. The friends who were there later recalled seeing an unfamiliar 1974-75 Pontiac Le Mans parked on the grass near the school's English building. A man stood nearby it, but when the witnesses circled back, both the car and the man were gone. The next morning, shortly after 7:30 a.m., police were called in to examine Dawn's body, which was partially clothed with an orange cloth wrapped tightly around her neck. Authorities did their best with the technology of the time. They released sketches of a person of interest and chased down leads connected to that Pontiac Le Mans, but nothing stuck, and the case grew cold, and the killer disappeared. For nearly 50 years, Dawn's murder loomed over McKinley High as generations of students came and went, many never knowing that their school had been the site of a brutal, unsolved crime. It wasn't until 2019 that cold case detectives re-examined Dawn's clothing, looking for evidence left behind, and there it was, a DNA profile. By 2023, the case finally had movement. Investigators turned to two men who had been questioned back in 1977, and brothers who had attended McKinley High, and one of them, Gideon Castro. Police tracked the brothers down, but instead of asking for their DNA outright, they got a bit creative. While in Chicago, they secretly collected DNA from one of the brothers' children, but it wasn't a match. They then did the same with Castro's son, and this time, the evidence was clear, and Castro was the killer.
Sent to the HPD DNA criminalist who compared that sample with the unidentified male, it was determined that the DNA profile obtained from the evidence matched the DNA profile of Gideon Castro.
And so recently, in January of 2024, police arrested 66-year-old Gideon at a nursing home in Mill Creek, Utah. A man who had once walked the halls of McKinley High as a student, who had stood in the same classrooms as Dawn, had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 5 decades. And for 47 years, he had escaped justice, but forensic science finally caught up with him. Now, after all these years, the man responsible for her death will finally face the consequences. Number 4. The Boca Raton Mall Murders. In the affluent city of Boca Raton, Florida, in 2007, 3 terrifying incidents unfolded at the upscale town center mall. Now, all of them involved mothers who had gone out to shop in the middle of the day. The similarities are hard to ignore, which makes the fact that the perpetrator has never been caught all that more terrifying. The first attack occurred on March 23rd. when 52-year-old Randy Gorenberg left the town center mall after a quick shopping trip. Surveillance footage captured her at 1:15 p.m. walking to her black Mercedes SUV. She had just purchased a John Legend CD and a new top. Now, what exactly happened, though, next is a mystery. But roughly 45 minutes later, a 911 call came from Governor Lawton Chiles Memorial Park, about 5 miles from the mall. And there, a witness reported hearing gunshots and seeing a body being pushed from a vehicle. That body was Randy, as she had been shot in the head and then tossed on the side of the road.
A woman in her 30s or 40s was found dead at Governor Lawton Chiles Memorial Park west of Del Rey around 2 o'clock this afternoon. Onlookers stood in disbelief watching police investigate the scene.
Her Mercedes wasn't found with her. Instead, security footage later showed it pulling into a Home Depot parking lot a couple of miles from where she was killed, but the driver was nowhere to be seen. Investigators believe her killer may have taken her to an ATM, hoping for a cash withdrawal, but there was a problem. The mother of two had no debit card. So could this have frustrated her killer? And could it have led to her execution? Detectives don't know. What they do know is that this was only the beginning. Because 5 months later, on August 7th, another mother was targeted. This time she survived. A woman, referred only to as Jane Doe for her protection, had been shopping at the mall with her 2-year-old son. And she loaded her stroller and shopping bags into the trunk of her SUV, and then walked around to the driver's side. In the span of just a few seconds, a man slipped into the vehicle. By the time she opened her door, he was inside, pointing a gun at her. For the next 45 minutes, Jane Doe was at his mercy. He forced her to drive around, stopping at ATMs to withdraw cash. But the abduction wasn't well planned, and he got lost, and then grew frustrated. Eventually, he forced Jane to stop in a parking lot. And there he bound her hands behind her back, blindfolded her, stole her license before disappearing into the night. On December 12th, Nancy Boccaccio and her 7-year-old daughter Joey arrived at the town center mall to pick up a gift card for Christmas. A mundane errand that should have lasted just minutes, but Nancy and Joey never made it home. Hours later, around midnight, a security guard patrolling the mall parking lot noticed something unusual. Nancy's black SUV, engine idling. Inside, he found a horrifying sight. Nancy and Joey were bound with duct tape, zip ties, and handcuffs. Blacked-out goggles covered their eyes, and both had been shot in the head.
I have a car park over by C on south side. 2 people in there. I don't know what's going on, what happened to them.
And their killer had forced them to withdraw money from an ATM before executing them in cold blood. They had been sitting in that parking lot for hours, and nobody had noticed. Each victim was a well-dressed mother driving a luxury SUV. Each attack occurred in broad daylight at the same location. Each involved an abduction, forced withdrawals at an ATM, and the use of restraints, except for Randy's case. Now, was she the first? Perhaps a botched attempt that led the killer to change his method. Retired FBI agent John McVeigh is adamant that all 3 crimes were committed by the same man. And the problem with that is that a predator like this doesn't just stop, not unless something makes him stop.
Are we looking for one killer?
Yes, because the coincidences are way too close. And, nothing before has happened there and nothing after has happened there.
And did he get caught for another crime under a different name? And did he move, leaving Boca Raton behind for a new hunting ground? Or is he still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again? Number 3, the gunslinger's last secret. On January 21st of 2022 in Alberta, Canada, an 82-year-old woman named Deirdre Globus passed away from natural causes. Her death was unremarkable. Just another obituary covering a quiet end to a long life. But when authorities received an anonymous tip nearly 2 years later, well, they discovered that Deidre had never actually existed. And she was, in fact, Sharon Keene, the American woman who got away with multiple murders for more than half a century. Back in 1960 in Independence, Missouri, 20-year-old Sharon was a young wife and mother living what appeared to be a typical suburban life. But the reality was that her marriage to James was crumbling, and she was seeing other men, and James had reportedly caught on. And then one fateful day, a single gunshot shattered the entire illusion of domestic bliss. As Sharon claimed, she had been in another room when she heard their 2-year-old daughter say, "How does this thing work, Daddy?" And then, bang. And she found her husband dead, a single bullet to the back of the head, his pistol lying nearby. And the authorities bought that story, and no charges were filed, and James's death was ruled an unfortunate mishap. And just like that, Sharon walked free. And with money from her husband's life insurance, soon after, Sharon walked into a car dealership looking for a fresh set of wheels. And that's where she met Walter Jones, a smooth-talking salesman who caught her eye. There was just one problem, though. He was married. And that, for Sharon, was not an acceptable inconvenience. The two had a short fling. In May of 1960, Patricia Jones, Walter's wife, and the mother to their 6 children, received an unexpected call at work. The woman on the other end of the line told her Walter was cheating and that they needed to meet up. Patricia agreed and was never seen alive again. In searching for his wife, Walter discovered that Patricia's co-workers had dropped her off at Independence Road, where there was a lady waiting for her whom they didn't recognize. Walter then confronted Sharon, who said she had talked with his wife, but that she had no idea what had happened to her. Later that evening, Patricia's body was found in a wooded area, having been shot 4 times. And the evidence collected, along with the eyewitness accounts, all proved that Sharon was the one who did it. And it wasn't long before police took another look at James' so-called accident, and suddenly Sharon had 2 murder charges hanging over her head. But just a year later, an all-male jury deliberated, and in a shocking turn, they found her not guilty. And Sharon, accused of killing her lover's wife, walked free. But she wasn't off the hook yet, as she still had to stand trial for the murder of her husband, and even though she was convicted, she lucked out again. The jury was deadlocked, which ended in a mistrial. And then came the decision that would haunt law enforcement for decades. Sharon was released on bond, and with that, she disappeared. And 2 years later in Mexico, Francisco Ordonez met a pretty young thing at a bar, and after talking, they eventually headed to his hotel room. Hours later, gunshots rang out, and when police arrived, Francisco was dead and Sharon Kine was holding the smoking gun. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. The Mexican court sentenced her to 13 years in prison. But even behind bars, Sharon remained untouchable. She earned a new nickname in there, La Pistolera, which meant the gunslinger. And then, on December 7th of '69, she vanished and escaped to unknown places. For over 5 decades, Sharon became a legend. Rumors swirled. Some believed she had died, her body hidden away somewhere. Others thought she had used her charm to build a new life under a new name. And then, in December of 2023, the tip came in. A woman named Deidre Glabus had died in Alberta, Canada. Authorities compared her fingerprints to the ones taken from Sharon Kine in the 1960s, and it was her.
On behalf of the Kinney family, we would like to state how happy we are that this chapter in our family history can be closed. Sharon was a woman that never faced the consequences of her actions. She caused great harm without thought or remorse.
Number 2. Mindhunter's secret weapon. Dr. Ann Burgess has never been an agent officially. She didn't carry a gun and wasn't trained in interrogation tactics, but she was armed with something the FBI desperately needed: an intimate understanding of trauma and its long-term effects on victims. When she stepped into the world of the FBI's behavioral science unit, well, she changed the game forever.
There were very few female agents teaching at that time.
All of my research is in the area of victims and the impact of victimization.
Burgess came up in a time when the options for women were limited. Teacher, secretary, and nurse. She chose the latter, earning her degree from BU and the University of Maryland. But where most nurses focus on physical healing, Burgess was drawn to something deeper: trauma, specifically in victims of violent crime. She co-founded one of the first hospital-based crisis counseling programs for victims of assault in the late 1960s. And at that time, this was uncharted territory. The victims then were more or less told to shake it off. There was no roadmap for what they went through. Burgess helped create one, and the FBI took notice.
And she says, I think you better to the FBI. Something on my taxes or something. Why are they calling me? What did I do? And he says he'd like to invite me down to talk about the book that I wrote.
At that time in Quantico, the behavioral science unit was conducting its own research, interviewing the worst of the worst, men like Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, and Ed Kemper. But something was missing. The agents were focused on the killers, trying to understand their motivations and triggers. And Burgess realized they were only looking at one side of the equation. Because what about the victims? And could understanding them help prevent the next crime? She became the BSU's secret weapon, analyzing the trauma serial killers left behind. She studied their victims' psychological wounds, their behaviors, their choices, because in those details she saw clues. And she proved that every crime scene told two stories: the story of the killer and the story of the victim. And one of her first major cases with the FBI was John B. Simonis, a man known as the ski mask assaultist, who confessed to over 80 assaults across 12 states. And the authorities needed to understand his pattern, so Burgess did what she did best. She spoke to his victims.
Did you talk about my
She didn't interrogate, just let them tell their stories in their own way. And when she put all the pieces together, a pattern emerged. Simonis wasn't choosing victims at random. He had a type: wealthy women, the kind who exuded a certain status. That insight led to a new avenue of investigation. If they knew his victim preference, they could predict his next move, and they did. The profile Burgess helped shape led to his arrest, and he was sentenced to 18 life terms and 2,406 years in prison. When young boys in Nebraska started turning up dead, the BSU put together a profile for the killer, and they got it wrong. A boy had been murdered, and a suspect was arrested, but the crimes didn't stop, and that's when the FBI called in Burgess. And she examined the second murder, looking at what kind of person the victim might have trusted. This wasn't someone who snatched kids off the street. He was someone who gained their trust. Burgess told authorities to look for a white male in his early 20s, thin build, possibly a teacher, coach, or scout leader. And that profile fit John Joubert, an assistant scoutmaster with a disturbing obsession with detective magazines. When authorities searched his belongings, they found a magazine dog-eared on an article about a young newspaper boy being abducted, eerily similar to the crimes he committed. Joubert was sentenced to death and executed in 1996. And not every case Burgess worked on was about hunting the killer. Sometimes it was about giving a victim a voice. In Illinois, 8-year-old Opal Horton had narrowly escaped a man who abducted her friend, Melissa Ackerman, and she had seen everything. But she was a child, and reliving the trauma through traditional questioning wasn't working. So Burgess, instead of asking Opal to talk about what happened, he just handed her a piece of paper and some colored pencils and said, "Draw it."
How did he look to you? He looked like he was in the mid-20s or something. He had things sticking out, like he hadn't shaved.
Opal did. She sketched the car, the man, and every tiny detail she remembered. And that drawing was the key to identifying Brian Duggan. Without Burgess's unconventional approach, he may have never been caught. Ann Burgess has many other stories just like this, and she's proved that killers don't act in a vacuum, and their crimes leave behind psychological fingerprints on their victims. And she showed that by listening to survivors and by studying the ones left behind, well, we can stop the next crime before it ever even happens. Number 1. The Beauty Queen Killer's Unsolved Secrets. Christopher Wilder was the kind of man people didn't suspect. An Australian-American millionaire, race car driver, and photographer. He had the money, looks, and charisma to blend into high society, but beneath that polished exterior, he was a vicious predator. His preferred hunting ground was all across America's shopping malls, though he was known to hang out at truck stops too. He would lure young women with the promise of modeling opportunities, offering to take their pictures as a professional photographer. Now, some walked away feeling uneasy at his offerings, but others, desperate for a shot of fame or perhaps just young and naive, stepped willingly into his trap.
I want to date. I want to socially meet and enjoy the company of a number of women. I would like to, a long term, but not right at this very moment, jumping into a marriage basis by any means. I am single, have not been married before.
That was the case for 16-year-old Tina Rosico, who survived a horrifying 9-day road trip with Wilder in 1984. He kidnapped her from a California mall, taking her to the other side of the country, during which he forced her to help him gather other young women along the way. And she was luckily one of the few who made it out alive, but how many others didn't? Even before his official kidnapping spree began, in which he killed 8 women in just a 6-week span, Wilder had been in trouble. In 1969, he was questioned by Sydney authorities regarding the brutal murders of 2 teenage girls found on a beach. And he fled to the U.S., where his wealth essentially shielded him from deeper scrutiny. And then in 1979, the body of 16-year-old Tammy Jo Alexander was discovered in a Caledonian, New York cornfield. As she had been shot in the head, her body left to the elements. And for decades, she was known only as the Caledonia Jane Doe, until DNA finally identified her in 2015. Authorities are uncertain, but they now wonder, did she cross paths with Wilder? Like many of his victims, Tammy was known to hitchhike. She lived near a truck stop, but most importantly, she fit the exact profile of the girls Wilder sought out: young, beautiful, and trusting. Just 4 years later, in 1983, 20-year-old Sherry Ball disappeared from Boca Raton, Florida. And she told her family she was heading to New York with a friend to pursue a modeling career. And 4 months later, her remains were found in western New York. New York State Police cold case investigator Christopher Weber said in 2017 that Wilder had never been ruled out in Ball's case. In fact, authorities found the similarities between her murder and Wilder's known victims to be, quote-unquote, intriguing. And Ball wasn't the only woman in Florida to vanish under suspiciously familiar circumstances. In Palm Beach County, Florida was Wilder's home base. It was where he built his life, his wealth, and possibly where some of his secrets remain buried. In 1983, 18-year-old Tammy Leppert disappeared from Rockledge, Florida. She had been a model and actress with some small roles in a couple of films. One of her last known appearances was in the 1983 movie Spring Break, where she participated in a boxing match scene.
3 points to the winning team, Pennsylvania!
Her mother, Linda, believed Wilder had something to do with it, and she even sued him before his death, claiming he had traveled to Brevard County to photograph her daughter. The lawsuit was later dropped, but was she onto something? And then there's the land. Well, Wilder owned several acres of property in Florida. In 1982, a real estate agent stumbled upon human remains on a piece of land owned by Wilder near Okeechobee Boulevard. And those remains were never identified. So the question is, how many others could still be out there? Now, Chris Wilder is long gone. He died in a hail of gunfire on April 13th of 1984 in a shootout with New Hampshire State Police. His almost 2-month killing spree had already cemented him as one of the most terrifying serial killers of the era. But with every cold case left unsolved, with every missing girl whose story was never fully told, Wilder's shadow lingers. New York State Police haven't ruled him out in several cases. The FBI has never closed the book on his possible victims. And survivors, like Tina Rosico, are now sharing their stories in The Beauty Queen Killer, 9 Days of Terror, a Hulu doc that sheds light on Wilder's crimes. And so, if you're interested and want to know more about the case, go check that out. So there were the strange and scary mysteries of the month for February 2025. If you enjoyed this, please remember to subscribe. And if you want to support us, go check out our new merch or watch our movie An Angry Boy for free. Links for that are all down below. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys over in the next one.